Welcome back to Big Riff Energy. It is Thursday, May 9th, and today we have to talk about Steve Albini. I'm sure everybody has seen the news of his passing yesterday. Things like this happen. You get these cliche phrases thrown around like immeasurable loss and stuff like that. He would probably hate that phrase, I would imagine, but it's true. It's true. I hate social media, but I didn't hate social media yesterday. I was just kind of checking in. My phone was blowing up all day, and I just saw so many beautiful tributes and that sort of thing. Again, he would probably be nauseated by all that shit, but it was nice to see like a community, a very diverse community, wholeheartedly united in mourning such a monumental figure for rock music and recording and making records and just art and being completely and totally uncompromising and filterless as a human being and making no attempts to justify your existence. So man, I'm going to approach this. I didn't know Steve personally. I know him like so many of us through his work, you know. I did record at Electrical a few times. I'm going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to talk first about his work. This show is Big Riff Energy, so we're going to go over the selected works of Steve Albini in the context of Big Riff Energy. I could preface this, I guess, by saying, this dude had just a monumental impact on my life, which I'll get into throughout this episode. But in kind of a perfect poetic sense of irony here, I'm not the hugest fan of the music that he made. But I will say, if you want a good starting point for Steve Albini's own music, I'm going to go super cliche again and say Shellac, 10,000 Hertz. The first song, Prayer to God, is one of those songs that I remember exactly the experience of hearing this song for the first time. And it's one of those songs that there's been many times throughout my life where I've just been stuck on it. On this one song, it's the only thing I could listen to. If you have heard it, you know what I'm talking about. If you haven't heard it, it is one of the most pure audio representations of all of the worst, ugliest, most painful aspects of being human. Jealousy, violent rage, murderous impulses, self-loathing, misanthropy, self-pity, all the worst aspects of being human illustrated in such a profound and real and again like filterless and unapologetic way. It's one of my favorite songs ever made. I know it's a very obvious and cliche pick when talking about Albini, but if you're unfamiliar with the guy's music, start with Shellac, 10,000 Hertz. What's so funny and striking about Albini's catalog to me, the news broke yesterday. I was getting a bunch of texts, and I mean, from people from all different periods of my life. I have a group text going with the second band I was ever in high school. So I was talking to those guys. We discovered so many of these monumental albums that Albini worked on back then when we were 15, 16 years old. Then people I know from Arkansas. I didn't know Steve personally, had a few encounters with him, recorded at Electrical a few times. I'll get into that later. But something that struck me with this situation in revisiting his engineer credits, for a guy that didn't seem to give a shit about metal and that really wasn't his preferred type of music. For a guy that didn't care, he sure did make a lot of the best metal records ever made. Unreal, man. So Steve Albini selected works according to Big Riff Energy. Number one, we have to start with Burning Witch, Towers. I don't know how well this will show up on camera. Very minimalistic artwork here. But, this is the debut EP by Burning Witch. First track, again, Sacred Predictions. One of my favorite songs. One of the best Doom songs ever recorded. it is thrilling and impossibly heavy and weird and nasty. And a lot of that is due to the sound, you know, which I'm sure Albini played a major role in that. There's nothing like this. I've talked about this band at length on this podcast, and I actually forgot that Albini recorded this. That's how insane the guy's catalog is. It's just, yeah, nothing like Burning Witch Towers. Check that one out, especially the first song, Sacred Predictions, one of my favorite songs ever. It's so weird, man. I was talking last episode about a very specific period of the Neurosis catalog, and one of my most distinct and powerful memories of discovering music that literally altered the trajectory of my life was coming back from Tulsa, Oklahoma with the drummer of my first two bands, middle school and high school, who I was talking to yesterday. And we went to Starship Records, which is where I bought Transylvanian Hunger. I was just talking to Ted about that. It's where I bought the first Mastodon album when it came out, 2003 or 4, somewhere around there. I Hate God, Dope Sick. You know, I just discovered so much cool stuff at this place. But one of our trips down to Tulsa, we got Sun That Never Sets by Neurosis and I Have Every Storm. And then shortly after that, I went back one and discovered Times of Grace. Now, these are from the box set, so I don't know whose bright idea it was to make this like minimalized artwork yet again, but yeah, Times of Grace, total life changer. I think the first one we heard was Sun That Never Sets. I was listening to this last night, driving back home from Austin in the fog, and God, just I can't overstate the impact that these things had on me. I Have Every Storm. I love early Neurosis. I went backwards after I discovered the band. Obviously, like Souls at Zero, Enemy of the Sun, Through Silver and Blood, all great stuff. And maybe it's a little bit nostalgia, but I think it's also just the sound of the first few albums of the Albini period. He started with them on Times of Grace, which is probably if I had to pick a favorite, it would be that one. The Doorway and Under the Surface are just like, I can't think of two better songs to start an album, you know. First time I ended up playing with Neurosis years later, they opened with The Doorway, and you know, my buddy Sean, bass player of Gatecreeper at the time, didn't get Neurosis, and then the second, I'll never forget this, the second they started playing that riff from The Doorway, he got Neurosis. Changed his life. I watched it happen in real time. We ran backstage and punished them after the show. So great. But yeah, I remember driving back home from Tulsa, Oklahoma, listening to these records with no frame of reference whatsoever. And even today, there's really not anything you can compare it to. But especially as a young, excited kid that still had that sense of wonder for music, that is more and more difficult to tap into as you age. These things literally put me on the life course that I've been on ever since. The drum sound, even as a kid, I was like, what is that drum sound? That's like the greatest sounding thing. It was like hearing an updated, nastier, more exciting Bonham When the Levee Breaks room sound, you know. I think Bonham had the best drum sound for his era. And it's weird because it's like in that time period, it was a drummer that was associated with the drum sound. But the Albini era, it's an engineer associated with the drum sound. It didn't matter who was playing drums. Steve Albini drums are going to be like the most exciting. There's just a vibration to them. There's a life to them. There's a personality. And even if the drummers performing have vastly different personalities, the Steve Albini drum sound personality is in there. I've spoken about this record. Where is it? High on Fire, Blessed Black Wings. First album I ever pre-ordered in my life from the Relapse mail order catalog. Again, for being a dude that's not even really into metal, how did this guy, I mean, he was just into the art of engineering records. He was into that. And that drew some of the best bands in all genres to work with him, I guess, is how this worked out. Because it's just astounding to me that a guy that's not even really in this world made literally a lot of the best metal records of all time. And if I had to pick a best High on Fire album, if I had to, it would be Blessed Black Wings for sure. It took me a little while to get into Death Is This Communion, the next one. And once I did, that definitely became a favorite. All their albums are good, but man, this one came out when I was 16. Again, I don't know if it's nostalgia. I don't know if it's the songs or the riffs or, I think objectively it's the most consistently badass High on Fire album. Every second of it's good. Blessed Black Wings is the album where Pike really sort of started excelling at vocal melodies and hooks and like verse melodies and chorus melodies and yeah, really like song oriented writing and arranging and vocals that started to emerge on Blessed Black Wings. And again, Steve Albini. What else? Oh yeah, I was kind of ripping on weed metal last episode, but there's some really, really, really good weed metal albums. Bongzilla, A Marijuanakin is up there for sure. But there's three that come to mind. That's one of them. The other two are Weedeater, Godluck and Goodspeed, Jason the Dragon. You want to talk about big riffs, man. Start to finish, just like some of the best, catchiest, most primal, badass, exciting, clever but obvious big riffs that you will ever hear. I would say, well, I've kind of been mentioning songs on these other albums. So for Times of Grace, I was gonna put a Spotify playlist together, and then I was like, nah, Spotify represents the evil incarnate that Steve Albini dedicated his life to raging against and trying to tear down and work in opposition against, So I'm just going to tell you, Times of Grace, The Doorway, and Under the Surface. What else do we have? Sun That Never Sets. Title track, The Hill, is that on this one? And let me see. Falling Unknown. Oh yeah, Stones from the Sky. Also, the first time I saw Neurosis, I think they closed with that. Scott Kelly split his head open on the microphone. Pretty epic. Yeah, Times of Grace, I already told you. So make a little playlist for yourself if you want to. Yeah. I Have Every Storm and A Season in the Sky from I Have Every Storm. Blessed Black Wings, I would say the title track, Brother in the Wind. Cometh Down Hessian, is that on that album? Pretty sure. Weedeater, I would say For Evan's Sake. Godluck and Goodspeed. They do great Give Me Back My Bullets, Leonard Skinner cover. And Jason the Dragon, the title track, is one of the best riff-centric songs that you will ever hear. Man, I think that's it for my little big riff-oriented Steve Albini collected works. I want to read something that he wrote real quick because I saw it yesterday and it really cracked me up. So first of all, the Chicago Reader has been very kind to Spirit Adrift. I've got a great friend over there, so this is nothing against. I have no problem with the Chicago Reader at all. Love it, but this is so funny to me. He wrote them in the 90s regarding like a year-end list that they did, and here's how he ended it. Had to do an edit for dogs barking. Here's what he wrote to the Chicago Reader. Artists who survive on hype are often critics' pets. They don't, however, make timeless classic music that survives trends and inspires generations of fans and other artists. There are artists in Chicago doing just that, but you don't write about them. You save your zeal instead for this year's promo fixtures. Shame on your lazy head. clip your year-end column and put it away for 10 years. See if you don't feel like an idiot when you reread it. Fuck you, Steve Albini, Evanston. I think this is the last relevant guy that raged against the parasitic nature of the music press, the music industry, and basically everyone that exploits or takes advantage of or manipulates the actual artists, the people who are making the art. So this has sort of inspired me to be even more of a menace. You got to read his thing that he wrote. I think it was in 1993. Steve Albini. Problem with Music, I think it's called. Yeah. Google The Problem with Music, or I might even put a link in the description here. As relevant today as it ever was, and maybe even more so because the money in music has really dried up, so it's gotten even more douchey and weird and parasitic. And I'll put it this way. It's not a conspiracy theory to state the fact that there's a large percentage of what I would describe as riffless cowards who have burrowed themselves into the touring world, the label thing, management. And I mean, there's a historical precedent for that. You know, the first wave of band managers all over the world, like back in the glory day, like Frank Sinatra into like the Black Sabbath era, they were all mobbed up. They were all literally robbing from their artists, stealing from their artists. And it's transformed a little bit, but at the core of it, it's a bunch of cowards and scumbags with no riffs, never written a fucking riff in their life, never created anything in their life, no backbone. Things like loyalty are quaint and naive to these people, you know? And I think Steve Albini was the last, if not one of the last guys that was relevant and important and significant, that was incredibly outspoken about this, and that tried to do his part to create an ecosystem for people outside of that parasitic fucking cesspool, you know? From what I understand, this dude lost money running Electrical Audio. For the level of studio that this place is, you know, I don't know that there's another place in the world that is at that level and is that affordable. And it sounds corny or whatever, and he would deny this, maybe, possibly, but he was doing it literally out of the kindness of his heart. Or maybe that's a little bit of a naive way of putting it, but it seems to me he was doing it because he realized how important it is for there to be a place like that where legitimate working class bands can afford to go make a record for real, not sitting at a computer with plugins and living in some kind of virtual reality, you know, making a record, but going and having the old school experience of making a record in an old school studio. So yeah, didn't know Steve personally, but like so many of you listening, I'm sure knew him through his work, and the impact that he had on my life is immeasurable. And so now I want to pivot into the vault, the story vault. Man, it's hard to shock me with death. I can't remember if I said that earlier. If I did, whatever, fuck you. Since COVID, this is probably not accurate, but it sort of feels like I've been losing folks once every month or something, like people that I actually know. And you get to a point where it's just like, get kind of numb to it. And so it's weird when somebody dies that I didn't know, and it shook me to my core, man. Crazy. So what I tend to do when that happens is my mind will go into the nostalgia vault and the crazy, fun, weird story vault, kind of like what I talked about last episode. So I'm fortunate enough to have recorded a few times at Electrical Audio, and I was thinking about all those times and all those experiences all day yesterday. And it seems like you guys appreciate story time on this podcast. So I'm going to back way up to 2007. This album here behind me, Wake, Voices of Omens. Steve Albini did not work on this, so you may be wondering why it's there. And I'll tell you why. This record was recorded by Sanford Parker. Drums were recorded in Studio B of Electrical Audio, which is the Weedeater drum sound, the Neurosis drum sound, so many other bands, but those are probably the obvious two big influences on Wake. So I was obsessed with this Voices of Omens record when it came out. I've talked about it a lot on this podcast. I was at the album release show where I think they played the whole thing. And I had a band going at the time called Queen Beast. It was our guitarist who came up with that name. We were just struggling so hard to come up with a name, and he was going through Misfits lyrics, and he took Demonomania and Queen Wasp, and we smashed them up, and it sort of fit our vibe. We had a weird we had some dudes who were semi-androgynous. So there was sort of a weird early 20s, late teens, sexually charged thing behind it. So it seemed to fit. And we had some songs. And this was back in the MySpace days. I reached out to Wake on MySpace and was asking them, who recorded their album, where they recorded it, this, that, and the other. And they hooked me up with Sanford. Talked to Sanford, and he's like, we can do it just how we did the Wake album. We do drums at Electrical, do everything else at my place. Electrical meant something to me even at the time. I'm 19 years old at the time. But I knew that drum sound. I knew that drum sound not just from the Wake album, but I knew it from Times of Grace, Sun That Never Set, all that. So we made it happen. We packed up some shit in a Yukon XL and drove from Arkansas to Chicago. First memory, you got to keep in mind, so this is 2008 at this point. I'm 20 years old. I've been talking to Sanford via MySpace. I've been looking at the gear list at the Electrical Audio page and all of this. I asked him what we needed to bring, and there was some sort of miscommunication because I think Sanford never anticipated that somebody could be fucking dumb enough not to bring guitars. But he was like, no, we pretty much got everything y'all will need. So we got up there. He's like, where are your guitars? And we didn't have our guitars because I thought Electrical had guitars. So hell of a way to start the recording process. So he made some calls. I remember he just, when we told him, Sanford was pretty fucking intimidating at the time. And we talked about this recently, and he was like, really? Everybody tells me I was intense and intimidating at the time. I didn't mean to be. But yeah, we were kind of scared of him. I remember telling him we didn't have our guitars. We're in Studio B of Electrical Audio. And he just went blank for a second. We're like, Jesus Christ. But then he sprung into action, made some calls. We went into a basement somewhere else in Chicago where they built Emperor cabinets. And I think maybe a few bands practiced down there. I'm pretty sure the band Indian was practicing in that basement. If you don't know Indian, please listen to Indian. Super great band. But some of those dudes helped us out. We got a Gibson SG and we got a Gibson Flying V. And that's what we used. We tracked live in Electrical Audio. The way it's set up is there's a giant 2-3 story drum room. And then on the second floor is the control room where Sanford was, and then separated but on the same level as the drums There's like a big, glass wall basically with sliding doors. And then there's the room where you set up the amps and stuff to do your scratch tracks or whatever you want to do. So we tracked as a full band. I remember miraculously our drummer at the time, who would sometimes get a little ahead of himself live, kind of go a little too hard here and there. He played tighter than he ever had by far. What else do I remember about that little electrical experience? So we were all psyched about a pool table. Let me throw up a picture of the pool table, quote unquote pool table at Electrical that we found when we got there. No pockets. And here we are coming up from Arkansas. We're smoking cigarettes and drinking beer, playing pool in bars, shooting the cue balls into the pockets and stuff. And we see this fucking thing with no pockets. And apparently it's like some other thing. It's like a big deal. And I guess Steve was really good at it, but we were a little bit disgusted by whatever fucking weird European type of pool or billiards this was. So that was another huge letdown. Almost as devastating as Sanford's disappointment when he realized we didn't have our guitars. So we had a member in our band who was just basically the chaos element. We call him Thor. Sorry, dude, I'm just going to tell him. Just imagine David Cross. Looks and sounds like, voice is basically identical, looks pretty much like David Cross. And Thor's role in the band was sort of like keyboards. He would play like third guitar every once in a while. Weird, what's that thing called? Like an auto harp or some shit. But I remember him sitting in what I would call like the living room of Electrical Audio, and they had all these VHS tapes. And when I went back 10 years later, it was like still all the same exact stuff. I think the fake pool table was gone. But so Thor, while we were tracking drums and doing other stuff, he was sitting with some kind of, I don't know if he had like he had a 4-track or something. He was recording. He was like ripping samples off of VHS tapes from the VCR player at Electrical Audio. And I'm going to do this for myself for a cue. Let's see. He was ripping samples off a Black Devil doll. Y'all ever seen that? Messiah of Evil, Return of the Living Dead. And then he was watching a bunch of stuff. I think the company was called Disinformation. And they had all these weird documentaries about like cults and Bohemian Grove and like borderline old school first wave Alex Jones crazy person shit. So he's ripping a bunch of stuff off of that. And yeah, then we moved over to Sanford's. So we stayed at Electrical. At that time you could bonk there basically. So we lived there for a few days doing drums. At this point, Steve Albini was in Ireland with Shellac. So he wasn't there. We didn't even run into him. But I think he was living there at the time. So then we moved over to Sanford's, finished everything up over there. And here's the big memories from that experience. And I'm talking about this is like barely even related to Steve Albini anymore. But every time I went to Electrical Audio, which was his studio, that studio was him. He lived and died there. Literally. That place changed my life every single time. And the last time we went, me and Mikey, for Ghost at the Gallows, the last Spirit Adrift record, the reason we went is because I wanted that experience again. Record's going to be a record, studio's going to be a studio, whatever. At the end of the day, it's like, it honestly doesn't matter that much. I realized that at some point in this process. What really sticks with you and what really matters on a long-term scale when you zoom out is the experience that you had making the record. And so this first time in 2008, here's the experiential stuff that I remember. We had a buddy who was sort of running a very cool burger place at the time, which was sort of borderline like in its infancy. It was like really getting hyped up. And I'm going to leave this dude nameless, Thank God. I think he's sober now. Chance he's listening to this. I don't know. What's up, dude? If you are listening to this, but the last I checked, he's still with us and he's doing great. But at the time, he was driving a gold Cadillac, and he was like the delivery guy for stuff that's not legal, you know? And I just remember him showing up at crazy intervals during the week or two that we were there, in this gold Cadillac with deliveries, you know? And then my bandmates were getting in the gold Cadillac and disappearing for long stretches of time and coming back. So the last day that we were there was November 4th, 2008. Let me just double check this. November 4th, 2008. Obama. Yeah. Grant Park. Yeah. Grant Park, Chicago, November 4th, 2008. Obama got elected president and gave his acceptance speech, and he's from Chicago. And my bandmates were partying with the guy in the gold Cadillac, but I was determined to go witness history. And please, you fucking morons, before you say something in the comments about politics, I don't give a fuck about your political opinion, and you shouldn't give a fuck about mine. And honestly, I don't really have one. But this was a historical event, so I'm going to talk about it because it was fucking cool. And if you talk about politics on this podcast, please, and this is satire, punch yourself in the face until you go into a coma. So, disclaimer there. But we're at the studio, and this was kind of before iPhones and shit like that. So I was just kind of asking, like, how far is Grant Park? And Sanford was like, I don't really know if you want to walk it. But I was kind of crazy at the time, 20 years old. So I'm like, okay, start walking in what I think is the general direction of Grant Park. And I'm literally, everyone I approach, cops or whoever, at first there were no people anywhere. But then I'm walking for like 30 minutes and I start seeing some people. And I see a cop. I'm like, where's Obama? I just literally ask everybody, where's Obama? And I keep asking everybody, where's Obama? And I think I walked for like 2.5 hours or something like that. And, you know, the longer I'm walking, the higher the concentration of people on the street, you know? And it gets to be more and more and more people, and I'm getting closer and closer and closer. And I end up at Grant Park. And I'm like standing in this giant crowd of people, and I watched Obama give his acceptance speech. And here's what I remember the most from this. Standing next to a brother with a do-rag and a blunt in his hand. And the second they announced the presidential victory of Barack Obama, this dude sparks up this giant blunt. He gets on his cell phone. It was like a Nokia brick at the time. And he just starts going, he's fucking blowing smoke all over everybody around him. And he's like, we won, motherfucker, we won, on his cell phone. Except he's not saying motherfucker, he's saying a word that I'm not going to say. He was talking to his people. But I was so overjoyed by seeing something like that up close and in person. And again, like, stick your political opinion up your ass. It was a fucking glorious moment, man, for so many reasons. But and politics aside, I wish everyone could experience what I experienced in Chicago that day. Because after that speech was over, you know, and we could talk at length about all the fucking innocent civilians that were drone bombed during the Obama presidency, and the fact that he, I think, deported more people than any president in history, and said he was going to legalize weed and couldn't get it done. We could talk about all the political failures and all the ugly shit that happened under the thumb of, you know, the American government and the American military during Obama's terms. Some awful shit happened, for sure. It always does. But that fucking night in Chicago, walking around those streets, it was like the excitement and the hope and the joy that their hometown boy had won the fucking presidency. I was 20 years old, walked in a liquor store, and those dudes gave me whatever I wanted. And I walked out and was partaking of all that shit in the middle of the street in front of police officers, and they didn't care at all. They were high-fiving people and shit. It was just, we've come so far in such a negative way from that. And that's a huge memory for me. And it's all because we wanted to go record at Electrical Audio. So I'm walking back 2-3 hours to the studio now, and just like in basically a fucking melee parade, like impromptu party / parade in the streets of Chicago. And I get a voicemail from the singer of my band, and they've been out with the dude in the gold Cadillac, and I guess they're at a bar. They went to like a rave or like a dance, like a fucking techno party at a bar or something. But it's just like noise on the voicemail, and I can barely hear his voice coming in and out. And he's talking about something about a bag on a table and this and that. I'm like, what the fuck is this dude talking about? And then I realize he says, do not snort what's in the bag. And I don't know if he's talking to me or if he's talking to somebody at the bar, but I can't get back a hold of him. And I get back to the studio. Our bass player is the only one there. It's late as fuck at this point, and we have to drive back to Arkansas the next day. I'm like, where is everybody? He's like, they're with the dude with the gold Cadillac. And I look over at a table, and there's a giant bag of white powder. And I'm like, what is that? Johnny's like, I don't know. And I go revisit my voicemail, and I can clearly hear, do not snort the bag or whatever. So it turns out this shit was like from the factory, pharmaceutical grade Valium in powdered form, which was transported back to Arkansas shortly after. Again, 20 years old, man. You can get away with this stuff physically and mentally at the time. So, dude, fast forward 7-8 years or later, I run back into Sanford Parker in Flagstaff, Arizona. He's playing with Scott Kelly and Dave French, who I would later tour with in Yob. And I am in the process of getting Spirit Adrift out of a shitty, terrible record deal and getting Spirit Adrift onto my favorite label at the time. And I'm talking to Sanford about making another record together. And that particular record, Curse of Conception, we made in Phoenix. But I was determined to make the next one, at least the drums, at Electrical. And we did. So 2018, the end of that year, we went back to Electrical. 10 years almost to the day for me. And Steve was there this time. Steve Albini was at Electrical. I remember maybe day 2 or 3, probably day 2. Our guitarist at the time, Jeff, was tripping because he woke up and sort of was coming to and walked out of his bedroom door and walked into Steve Albini. And he was very, very excited about that. At some point on that trip, I was sort of out of it, waking up myself one day, and I was in the common area, which was identical to how it was in 2008, 10 years prior, with the exception of the weird imposter pool table being gone. But I'm sitting on a couch, and there's this dude, I'm pretty sure it's an intern at the studio, just like milling around. And he's got like a pleasant vibe. I'll just say that. We didn't really say anything to each other. We just had a pleasant vibe. And he sits down on the couch, sort of on the other side of the room, and he's having his coffee or whatever. He opens a laptop, and he's on some kind of video call or something. And as I'm sort of waking up, I look and realize, oh, it's Steve Albini, and he's doing an interview. And I tried to not allow my energy or my vibe to change, but it was very difficult. So I sat there sort of like imploding internally and just sat and listened to Steve Albini give an interview in real time. and it was fucking rad. That was a great time making that record. We finished everything up in Phoenix, but did the drums at Electrical. And so fast forward again, post-COVID, it's time to make another Spirit Adrift record. And I want to go back to Electrical. So we did. Me and Mikey went back, got an Airbnb in Ukrainian Village, within walking distance of Electrical. These memories, man, are just so, it's one of the best parts of making a record is the experience. And that's something that Steve provided for bands like us, just working class bands, the ability to go to the big shitty, and go in a studio that just, when you see it, your mouth drops, your jaw drops. I don't know how your mouth would drop, but yeah, I got like straight up precious memories of me and Mike Fury in this Airbnb. I gave him the bed and took the fold out couch, which had like a metal bar right in the tailbone / rectum position. It was like some shit out of Hellraiser. It was like a fucking Iron Maiden torture device from Hellraiser. So he had to go, I was like digging through every nook and cranny of this tiny little Airbnb to find anything soft, towels and fucking whatever, and layered this thing up. And Mikey wanted to switch, but I'm like, dude, you're the one doing drums. Like, you take the bed. And I remember walking, getting up, listening to Rolling Stones' Sticky Fingers every morning, getting the vibe going, getting the coffee going, lighting a damn candle. We watched Whiplash. If you haven't seen it, highly recommended. Me and Mikey really loved watching that together while getting drum tracks done, We watched No Country for Old Men, which was like a huge influence lyrically on the last Spirit Adrift album. Walking to the studio every day. Literally the first day of fall, it was like somebody flipped a switch from summer to fall. We were watching the trees change. We could feel the wind change. Just meeting Sanford there every day. Steve was in town that time. I guess I could talk a little bit about the recording because it's funny, all the little weird connections and things that happen on this journey. I was talking to Dark Throne Ted about how him and Fenriz tracked those albums, and it's guitar and drums and it's live. He was talking about the energy of a good take when you're doing it live. And that's how we did it. That's how we did Ghost. We had Mikey in that big ass drum room and me in the little, I say little, but good size amp room, and we would jam. Mike and I had wood shopped those songs for months in Austin, and we would just jam like we did in the room. We did have some click tracks to help us out, but what we did is we played the parts of the songs at our own natural feel, and then we moved the click tracks to match us, and they were there if we needed them. But we tracked live, man, and it was the feeling of two guys who had played the songs a lot together, catching a vibe. And I really think that was a big part of what was at the core of Albini, was just being there to catch a vibe, So Steve was there that time, and we ran into him a little bit. The last interaction that I had with him, I will never forget, and it's so weird and perfect in like a Coen Brothers kind of way and a Steve Albini kind of way. We were in the kitchen, and he came up. He was in Studio A. We were in Studio B. He came up. He was wearing his trademark Electrical Audio coveralls. And I think Sanford and I and an intern were standing there, and Steve came in the kitchen. I was wearing a Yob long sleeve t-shirt. And Albini sees the Yob shirt, and he goes, "Yob, that was my favorite burger at Kuma's Corner." For those of you that don't know, Kuma's Corner is a metal-themed burger shop that originated in Chicago. "Yob, my favorite burger at Kuma's Corner. And they got rid of it." And I said, "Bummer." And there was a long pause. And it was like, well, back to work. And that was it. I thought he was going to talk to me about the band Yob, and he was just lamenting the fact that Kuma's got rid of the Yob burger. And that was all we had to say to each other. And I will, man, I don't know. I'll treasure that for forever. And in a way, like, I'm so happy that was the most memorable encounter that I had with him, as opposed to talking about music or making records, or me just like trying to be low key, but then word vomiting to him about what an impact he had on my life or something. He would have fucking hated that. And you know what? I probably would have hated having that as a last memory of that dude. The lamenting of the Yob burger going away at Kuma's Corner is so much better of an experience to have with that guy. Yeah, I remember when we went in 2008, one of the things that we were constantly joking about or wondering about, there were two things with Thor, my David Cross doppelganger bandmate. Thing number one was, because Thor likes to talk, just imagine David Cross going on like an unhinged rant and you'll be in the neighborhood. I'm sorry I keep calling you David Cross, Thor. I know you fucking hate it. So we were always joking on the way up there, you know, what's going to happen when Thor runs into Steve Albini? Because there are a few people that I've encountered in life that I would say are as opinionated and outspoken and filterless and intense as Steve Albini, but Thor's one of them. So we saw these like two suns going supernova as they collided into each other. But, you know, unfortunately, Steve was in Ireland at the time, so we didn't get to witness the fucking chaos that would have ensued with Thor and Steve Albini having some sort of heated discussion or debate. Thing number two we wondered with Thor is the man goes nowhere unprotected. I don't want to blow up your spot too bad, but you may or may not know that Chicago has a handgun ban. So the other running joke was, does Thor have a handgun? And we didn't know the answer until it was over. I was like, you better not bring a fucking handgun. Last thing we need is you going to jail in the middle of this record. But you can't keep a good man down. And yes, Thor did have a handgun, allegedly. Again, this is like, this whole podcast is satire. But yeah, I'm kind of glad. I wish we could have seen the Thor Steve Albini explosion, but I'm kind of glad that I didn't have that experience with Albini. I'm kind of glad it was just a fucking mundane. It was and it wasn't. It was mundane, but it was just like profoundly meaningful in the context of like what that guy represents. He taught me a lot, man. You know, the whole reason that we took the time and the energy and spent the Sony money to go back to Electrical to do the last Spirit Adrift album was for the experience. I was talking about that a lot with my wife before we did it. I was like, we could easily make this record here. It would probably be, you know, to most listeners, I can't even tell the difference, you know, and you can actually, I don't want to give out too many insider tips here, but you can get virtual instrument drum packages now that are drums that are recorded in Studio A or Studio B of Electrical Audio through the board and everything. So, and your average person is never going to be able to tell a difference. I hate to tell you, but even like a lot of lifer trained engineers would be hard pressed to tell a difference. So why would you go to Electrical Audio and put in the effort of getting on a plane and doing that and getting an Airbnb and risking like being stuck in Chicago with no good takes, you know, all that. It's a lot more high risk, but a lot more high reward. But the reason you do that is because life is about having great fucking experiences. And now, anytime I look at that record on my shelf, anytime I listen to that record on my shelf, I'll think of that experience. And that's embedded into that record permanently. And that's embedded into my life permanently. just like Times of Grace by Neurosis, or Jason the Dragon by Weedeater, or 10,000 Hertz by Shellac, or you name it. Just like those are embedded into my life permanently. And those records, like I said, I'm not exaggerating when I say that they changed the course of my life forever. I'm sitting here and this is proof that they did. So I would say indirectly, but it's not indirectly. Steve Albini directly shaped the course of my life, and Electrical Audio directly shaped the course of my life. Every record I made there changed my life, literally, in some sort of tangible way. And that's what this shit's all about, man. And God, it fucking sucks, dude. It sucks where things are headed, and that all aspects of life are being overrun by weak, disloyal, scummy, riffless fucking cowards. And Steve Albini represented the antithesis of that. Whether you liked what he said or liked what he represented or didn't like it, I don't think he cared much about justifying his existence or his work to the world. He just did his fucking work, and he was what he was. And he has inspired me, and his passing has inspired me to be even more of a menace toward the fucking forces of riffless evil that he stood in opposition toward. I don't know. It's getting sort of fucking melodramatic at this point, wouldn't you say? He'd probably be cringing listening to this bullshit. But man, I fucking love Steve Albini. I always will. I didn't even know the guy, and I'm fucking pretty shook over this whole thing. So to those of you that did know him or did work with him extensively, I'm sorry, man. I can't imagine what you're feeling like now. And to the rest of us that didn't know him personally but knew him through his fucking unrivaled work, I'm sorry to y'all too, man. And feels bad, man, but it's okay to feel bad. All right. Rest in peace, Steve Albini. We fucking love you.